Thank you. We now come to the statement on the government response to the Streatham incident, and I will just allow people who need to leave to do so swiftly and quietly in order that I might call to give us the statement the Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice, Mr. Robert Buckland.
With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to make a statement about the senseless and horrific terror attack in Streatham yesterday afternoon. 2 members of the public were brutally stabbed as they went about their business on the busy High Road. Another was injured as our brave police stepped in before even more harm could be done. And honourable members, I'm sure, will join me in sending our thoughts and prayers to the victims, their families, and to all those affected by this appalling attack. I would also like to pay tribute to our outstanding emergency services who once again ran towards untold danger to protect the public. The police who shot the offender to save others, and the ambulance staff who fearlessly tended the wounded despite the risk to their own lives. Protecting the public has to be the #1 priority for this government. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Streatham incident is subject to an ongoing police investigation, and as such, I'm limited in what I can say at this time, but I would like to share what details I am able to with the House. A known terrorist senselessly stabbed a man and a woman on Streatham High Road about 2 p.m. yesterday afternoon. The attacker has yet to be formally identified, but police are confident that it was 20-year-old Sudesh Amman. In December 2018, he was imprisoned for 3 years and 4 months for 16 counts of distributing extremist material and for the possession of material likely to be useful for the purposes of preparing a terrorist act. The sentence he received was a standard determinate sentence, and that means that 1 week ago he was automatically released halfway through that term. The parole board had no involvement in the matter. The law required automatic unconditional release at the halfway point. A man was being followed by armed police officers when he made his attack, and they immediately shot him dead before he could harm any others. They stepped in despite the fact he appeared to be wearing an explosive device, which has now been confirmed as fake. A female member of the public in her 20s was hurt by broken glass as shots were fired to end the threat. She remains in hospital, as does the male victim in his 40s, who I'm pleased to say is now recovering after initially fighting for his life. The other female victim in her 50s has since been discharged, and our thoughts are with them all. As this is an ongoing investigation, it would be not appropriate for me to comment further on the case while the full facts are being established, but I would like to reassure honourable members that our outstanding security services and the police have the full support of the government as they investigate this atrocity. Madam Deputy Speaker, I also want to talk about our security services, police, prison and probation officers and their joint response. All of these operational agencies are truly first class, and they're the epitome of public duty. And the swift response to yesterday's attack, monitoring the threat and responding quickly when it escalated, can give us confidence that the police and security services are doing all they can to keep the public safe. And our prisons and probation services have robust measures in place to deal with terrorist offenders, and we're at the forefront of international efforts to counter this threat. All terrorist prisoners and individuals who are considered to be an extremist risk are managed through a specialist case management process. Most can be dealt with as part of the mainstream prison population, but where it's necessary, a small number of the very highest risk offenders are now managed in separation centres. The time an offender spends in prison is an opportunity to do our best to rehabilitate, recognising that this is no simple challenge. Psychological, theological and mental health interventions are all used, and HMPPS psychologists supply 2 formal counter-radicalisation programmes used both in custody and in the community. And in addition, the Desistance and Disengagement programme was rolled out in prisons in 2018. And this provides a range of intensive, tailored interventions designed to address the root causes of terrorism. And I want to pay tribute to the work of our prisons and probation staff. They're dedicated to keeping the public safe. They work tirelessly to try to turn lives around, even in the face of such a deep-seated ideology. Now, the tragic events at Fishmongers Hall in November of last year showed that we need to look carefully at the way we deal with terrorist offenders. And I have long been clear, as has my right honourable friend the Prime Minister, that automatic halfway release is simply not right in all cases. After the London Bridge attack, the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary and I immediately promised a major shake-up of our response to terrorism. And 2 weeks ago, the Home Secretary and I announced clear measures, a tough new approach and a new commitment to crack down on offenders and to keep people safe. And those measures include introducing longer and tougher sentences for serious terrorist offenders, ending release for them before the end of their custodial term, and opening up longer licence periods, whilst keeping the worst offenders locked up for a mandatory minimum 14-year term. Secondly, the overhaul of prisons and probation with tougher monitoring conditions, including lie detector tests to assess risk. Thirdly, doubling the number of counter-terrorism probation officers and also investing in counter-terrorism police, providing an increase in funding of £90 million from this April. And finally, putting victims first by reviewing the support available to them, including an immediate £500,000 boost for the Victims of Terrorism unit. And we've also announced an independent review of our multi-agency public protection arrangements, the MAPA arrangements, to be led by Jonathan Hall QC. And this will be looking at pre-release planning as well as the management of offenders upon release into the community. And many of these measures will be included in a new counter-terrorism sentencing and release bill to be introduced in the first 100 days of this re-elected government. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, yesterday's appalling incident makes the case plainly for immediate action. We cannot have the situation, as we saw tragically in yesterday's case, where an offender, a known risk to innocent members of the public, is released early by automatic process of law without any oversight by the parole board. We will be doing everything we can to protect the public. That is our primary duty. And we will therefore introduce emergency legislation to ensure an end to terrorist offenders getting released automatically, having served half of their sentence with no check or review. The underlying principle has to be that offenders will no longer be released early automatically, and that any release before the end of their sentence will be dependent upon risk assessment by the parole board. We face an unprecedented situation of severe gravity, and as such, it demands that the government responds immediately, and that this legislation will therefore also apply to serving prisoners. Now, the earliest point at which these offenders will now be considered for release will be once they have served 2/3 of their sentence, and crucially, we will introduce a requirement that no terrorist offender will be released before the end of their full custodial term unless the parole board agrees. And we will ensure that the functions of the parole board are strengthened to deal even more effectively with the specific risk that terrorists pose to public safety. So, for example, we will ensure that the appropriate specialisms are in place. That work is in train, and we will take steps to implement this as soon as possible. When someone is released, we will always ensure that terrorist offenders are subject to the most robust safeguards, and we will consider whether new legislation is required to provide additional assurance. And finally, we will review whether the current maximum penalties and sentencing framework for terrorist offences is indeed sufficient or comprehensive. On the underlying principle that terrorist offenders should no longer be released until the parole board is satisfied that they are no longer a risk to the public. As I've said, Madam Deputy Speaker, keeping our streets and our people safe is our first duty. We face a threat from an ideology that takes no heed for others, and we must use every tool we can to make sure that that threat is neutralised. The British public have a proud history of coming together in times of adversity against those who seek to divide us, and it is together we can make sure that the terrorists who seek to threaten our way of life will never win. The government will do everything in our power to defeat them and to ensure that the public is protected. And I commend this statement to the House.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I was only able to have sight of the Secretary of State statement 20 minutes before he started speaking, which left me, I do think, in an unacceptable position where I had to prepare my statement based upon press briefings on such a serious matter. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do want to begin by saying that my thoughts are with the people who were attacked yesterday and their families, and with the people of Streatham who witnessed this absolutely horrific attack. I also want to pay tribute, Madam Deputy Speaker, to our police and emergency services for their professionalism and courage that they demonstrated in their swift response to this attack. The first responsibility of a government is to keep its citizens safe. Tragically, the cuts that we have seen over the previous decade across our justice system, to the police and to prisons, to probation and to the CPS, have left our communities less safe, which is why our justice system is in a state of crisis. It will, of course, take time for the full facts around yesterday's terrible attack to come out, and we owe it to those affected to carefully assess what happened and take the action necessary to reduce the risk of similar attacks happening again. Experts, Madam Deputy Speaker, have raised serious concerns about the impact of austerity on the government's programmes for dealing with terrorism offenders. A former CPS Chief Prosecutor for North West England described these programmes today as being largely underfunded and poorly executed. Does the Secretary of State agree with this assessment, and what is being done to address this? Turning to prisons, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the second such attack carried out by a recently released prisoner in recent months. So how many of the recommendations from the 2016 review into extremism in prisons have been implemented? Huge cuts to prison budgets have not only left our prisons with more than 2,000 fewer officers than in 2010, they also led to an exodus of experienced staff with the loss of tens of thousands of years of experience. And that experience is vital in maintaining safety and order in prisons and, crucially, in identifying and dealing with radicalisation. Figures that I obtained last year show that the picture in high-security prisons is even worse, with over 400 fewer prison officers in high-security prisons compared with 2010. So does the Secretary of State believe that those cuts to staffing levels have made it more difficult to monitor people convicted of terror offences in prisons? And those same figures revealed that Belmarsh, where the Streatham attacker was held until his release last week, has a staggering 100 fewer prison officers than it did back in 2010. So by what date will the government return all high-security prison staffing numbers to 2010 levels? Sadly, the problems in our criminal justice system are not limited to prisons. Probation manages hundreds of thousands of offenders released from prison. All but a handful of the most dangerous prisoners will at some point leave prison. Probation, Madam Deputy Speaker, has a vital role to play in keeping our communities safe, and the decision by the government to break up our probation system, alongside the decision to outsource the monitoring of some of the most dangerous offenders in bail hostels, has left the public at higher risk. So what assessment has the Secretary of State made of the consequences of the failed probation reforms on the monitoring of those convicted of terror offences? Finally, on sentencing, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the most dangerous offenders, judges can ensure that prisoners are not released halfway through their sentence, that instead they serve a minimum of 2/3 and are only then released if the parole board determines that it is safe to do so. We will look at the proposals that have been referred to in the Secretary of State's statement, because our priority must be to keep the public safe. But to be clear, the government cannot use sentencing as a way of distracting from their record of bringing the criminal justice system to breaking point.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for making his points, and I'll do my very best to answer all of them. First of all, with regard to the last point he makes about sentencing, he's right to, I think, make reference to the extended determinate sentence system. But of course that depends upon the learned judge making a finding of dangerousness. And in this case, in this particular case, that of course was an option open to the court, but the court took the decision not to do that, which is why it was a standard determinate term. So therefore more needs to be done with regard to the framework to make sure that it doesn't depend on the need to make such a finding, so that we can end automaticity when it comes to early release. And I would very much hope that he and the party opposite would support that approach